You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Shawn Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
So we had a meeting earlier, our normal podcast meeting, and we always wrap our meetings up with a one-word close. Like, how are you feeling? How did you feel about the meeting? How did, those types of things. And my one word was hurried.
Yeah.
And that just continued as I was on my way over to the studio this morning. I come up to your office, so I was a little bit late getting here, and I'm waiting for your elevators down on the first floor, and they're just not coming. It's okay. Sometimes the elevators, and I'm waiting, and they're just standing there. I'm like, geez, watch, looking up to see where the elevators are because there's three of them, and which one's coming first. And finally, this other lady, she walks in. And she kind of looks at me and she looks at the elevators and she goes, "Oh, is the light out on the button that you push?"
That's a thing?
Well, there's that button you push for the elevator and the light comes on, which indicates that
you never pushed it.
I never pushed it.
Oh, I see.
I was just standing there like an idiot. And I said, "No, I'm sure that button works just fine. You just have to push it." So she just kind of looks at me and pushes it. Got on, so I made it up here. So,
well, I'm glad you made it.
I did.
I wanted to talk more about your book because we talked about it recently. We got into the idea of plateau jumping, the concepts behind it, but we didn't talk in depth about the levers of change that are required to move you from one plateau to another plateau.
Yeah.
So before we dive in, short overview on what plateau jumping is and why these levers of change are important.
Yeah, so the book is designed for people who feel stuck, right? And that's all of us. We've all felt stuck at one time or another. And the big question is, how do you extract yourself from that place where you feel stuck? How do you move up to this other level? And I started working on this years ago as I was doing some coaching for business owners and looking at what do you have to do to move up, not just sort of a 5% a year or a little bit of, improvement from last year.
Yeah.
How do you make bigger changes? If you're looking at really advancing your business forward in a new way. And so I started making all these lists of things you could do. And they started out as tactics, right? Well, you could do, you could send birthday cards to your clients. You could, greet people when they come in the office. And all of these were at the micro level. I'm like, this is not going to be helpful. And I started moving up and organized all of those things into categories. And they fell into 4 categories. They fell into the categories of changes to your systems. You can change, systems and processes. You could make changes to your goals. So you could create bigger, better goals. You could create micro goals for each quarter. You could even create daily goals. I started looking at habits that you could develop because habits became more important as I looked at it over things like discipline and motivation, which I originally thought were the driving forces, but turns out habits sort of take over. So you want to cultivate positive habits, look at putting friction in place of bad habits. And then looking at what changes in relationships would you have to have. So this became, all right, so do I hire different people to do different roles? How do I lead people on my team differently? How do I view myself, my relationship with myself? And so I had culminated with what I thought was a progression moving up to relationships being the most important thing, because it is, it's so all encompassing. Our relationship with our family, our relationship with our employees, our relationship with friends, associates, God, ourselves. There's a lot there, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm sharing this with my dad, and so it's important to know. Yeah, I mean, obviously, but I'll talk for the sake of the podcast. So my dad is a PhD in psychology, so he does therapy work, been doing that for years and years. And so I said, hey, I'm looking at this concept of how people can make bigger changes in their lives, right? Primarily business. And I said, there are 4 things that people can change. I've narrowed all the things that you could make changes to into 4 categories: systems, goals, habits, and relationships. I said, you can't make a change without changing at least a couple of those. He goes, oh, that's interesting. He goes, but you've left one out.
Okay.
And I said, oh, what is that? He says, you've got to be able, in most cases, to change your beliefs. And I was like, damn it. He's right. And there's nothing worse than knowing you have the right answer than your dad telling you you didn't, right? There's nothing, as you know, right? Time and time again. So the idea was that, okay, so there are now 5 things, right? So, all right. So we've got systems and goals and habits and relationships and beliefs. And that became an overwhelming project. Because if you think about it, how are you going to create a platform, a tool, a workbook, a worksheet, even a book that does justice to each of these, much less beliefs, right? You could write 50 books on how to change beliefs. So there's one section of a book, and I'm going to do it justice. And so it became overwhelming. And so the project sort of sat for years until I could come back and figure out the best way to approach it. And what I ended up doing in the book is giving it, admitting that this can't be all encompassing if it's one section of a larger book, but to say, here's how you can think about this concept, and here's how you can approach improving it. And certainly there's more work that all of us can do on each of them. But that was the original concept of looking at these 5 levers of change. And you've certainly got to identify, if you're wanting to make a change, start there. What of these 5 levers should I start working on?
How many of those do you have to change? Do you have to change all 5?
No, but you have to change more than one.
Okay, so at least 2.
Yeah, that's what I've looked at, and I started saying, all right, so if you said, well, I want to make a big change, I want to make a big change in my life, and I'm just going to believe differently. Well, that's hardly enough. I mean, it's important,
sure,
but it's hardly enough.
It depends on what that change in belief is. It might not even be possible to simply. It's rarely possible to say you're going to believe differently.
Well, it's the most challenging of the 5, right? Because one of the things around changing beliefs, if that's the lever of change that needs to be changed, is that it takes a level of self-awareness to identify that the beliefs you held weren't correct or need to be drastically changed, right? It takes a level of self-awareness to do that. The problem is the people who need to improve on self-awareness the most are not self-aware enough to know that.
Okay.
Right. So it becomes a circular problem.
So what about the other 4 that are a little bit more straightforward? Goals, habits, systems, and relationships. What does it look like to change goals, for example?
Okay. So what I started looking at on each of these is the perspective that you would have on these levers, right? And so I'll tell you a story. There is a in town. I was working on a project for a client. This client had donated a massive amount of money to build a chapel up on a hill, right? This beautiful chapel. And so I was there meeting with her, and we were talking about the chapel. The chapel was under construction at the time. So it's set up on this hill. And we were looking down below the hill. So we were there for an early morning concrete pour, right? You do that in the morning because it's nice and cool. You can't do it during the middle of the sun. It messes up the curing of the concrete. So we were there early morning pouring this concrete or watching it be poured. And we were looking down in the field down below the hill. And we see these people and they're kind of milling around. There's a couple pickup trucks. And then we see this glow of this flame. And it's basically the propane burner that's inflating this hot air balloon. And so it's just glowing in the morning and it's lighting up and we see them inflate it, see them take off. We're just watching this in awe because it's pretty cool to watch. And I just mentioned kind of to myself, man, that'd be cool. And that's about all I said. Like, wow, yeah, that would be neat. That would be fun. And the next time I saw her, this woman, she handed me an envelope. In the envelope, she had found out who this guy was that owned the hot air balloon.
Wow.
And she paid him to take me and my wife on a hot air balloon ride. He goes, here you go. You said you wanted to do that and thought I'd get that done for you. I was like, wow, I'm expecting that. It was very, very nice, very generous. And so one early October morning, it's nice and cool. I mean, you kind of see frost forming on your breath. It's cold and it's, we've reconvened with this hot air balloon pilot and the sun is just barely coming up in the east and it's cold and we're doing the same thing we had witnessed a few weeks ago. And we inflate this balloon. And all of a sudden he says, let's go. We have to get in and we take off. And I'm always looking at learnings and connections. And as soon as I got in, and I wasn't ready,
yeah,
I was, but that was the time. And so my first learning that I attached to that experience was, you're hardly ever ready. So the time will come and you will need to go. And so I kind of made a mental note of that. And we take off and we're floating with the wind across town. And now this is a town I've lived in for a long time. And so we're looking at the university that we went to. We fly over the university, fly over neighborhoods, fly over shopping areas and fields and roads. And the interesting experience was that these were all things I was very, very familiar with. I had gone to this school, this university. I'd been to that neighborhood. I'd shopped in those areas, but they looked totally different. It was a new perspective. And so we're flying. I'm like, I can see things from this different perspective. And so I made a mental note. Sometimes the things you think you know best look different if you'll just have a fresh perspective. And so I kind of make this mental note. And I start thinking, well, how do you land these things? Right? It's not like a plane where you just kind of throttle back the engine, pull the flaps, steer it in. You're going with the wind. And so I just had this vision that we would gently just kind of set down in a field of daisies or something. And so eventually we've gotten past the city and we're out in this field and he says, all right, here's how it's going to go. We're going to brush the top of these trees over here. And then we're going to hit over there. And he kind of points. He says, hey, hit, we're going to hit. And say, we're going to land. And he goes, what's going to happen is we're going to hit. It's going to drag us for a little bit. We're going to pitch sideways about 45 degrees. And he points to us and with a pretty serious look on his face. is don't jump out, because you're going to want to jump out. Don't. You jump out, the rest of us are going right back up. Right? And so I made a note. I was like, when times get tough, don't bail. Times are going to get tough. And it's those times when you take a hit, like we were taking it, that you reflect on those fresh perspectives. And so it was a simple exercise, simple hot air balloon ride. But I started looking for what were my learnings at each step. And I started applying that to these levers to say, what is it that you know about your interaction with these levers of change, systems, goals, habits, tips, and beliefs, that you could take a fresh look at, right? And so if there's any theme, it is maybe what you know about this, you should look at it differently, right? Maybe the opposite is the way to go. Maybe that's the way to go. And so I started working with clients to say, all right, they were struggling with how do I grow my business? Okay, maybe I need to get more clients. Okay, well, that's what they know. That's what everybody had told them. And so I started thinking, well, maybe the opposite is true. Maybe you should get fewer clients that have more potential. Maybe you can streamline. Maybe you don't have to get bigger. Maybe you can take time off and become more efficient. And so I started looking at everything and just challenging what I knew.
So it seems like the traditional goal setting framework of whatever I want to get out of life, business, this hobby, whatever, this relationship, whatever I want to get more of that. And so I'm going to set a goal around getting more of that. And you're saying that framework maybe not always the most helpful.
Well, it might be that the goals were wrong, because what a plateau is telling you, right? And this is the beautiful thing about plateaus. People, they look at plateaus as a negative, but this is the beautiful thing about getting to a plateau. What it tells you is that what you're doing right now isn't working. That's what it tells you. So maybe if you've spent your career saying, maybe I want to raise my goal, I'm going to set a goal at the beginning of the year to grow 10%, blah, 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 blah. And then that just stops working. What you used to do is no longer taking you where you want to be. Maybe it's different. Maybe you say, I'm going to hold my business level, but I'm going to do it in less time. Maybe I'm going to change vendors. Maybe I'm going to start looking at quarterly goals rather than annual. Maybe it's just the things you're doing aren't working. So try something new. I'll give you an example on, we were talking about goals, but let's talk about beliefs, for example. That's another one of the levers. And this was the bigger challenge, right? To say, what changes in beliefs do you need to make to be able to make a plateau jump, right? Well, clearly the beliefs need to change, but how do you know what they need to change? And this is really challenging, right? And so there's a book called by Marshall Goldsmith, and the book is "What Got You Here Won't Get You." I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've heard people say that phrase.
So that's where it comes from, right? And the idea is that you've got to make these changes, right? And so I started challenging everything. I started challenging that phrase that I had heard, right? What got you here won't get you. And it's a good book, and it's got some valid points, but I started challenging this concept. And I'm having this conversation with Kathy Colby, who founded Colby Institute and does Colby testing. And I started asking her about that. I said, what do you think about the concept of what got you here won't get there? Right? Because I was sort of questioning. She goes, oh, that's right. She goes, what got you here must necessarily get you.
Okay, that sounds different than what you're saying, which is I've got to change my goals and my habits and my systems. I got to do everything different.
Right. And The challenge there was, that's a challenge in beliefs. I'm giving an example of challenging beliefs, but here's where it comes in. When you look at selecting the levers of change that you want to affect, when you look at selecting which things you're going to work on, our tendency is that I want to try something new, right? Maybe, goals aren't working. I'm going to build a new system. I'm going to hire a new person, whatever it is, right? And the idea there is that whatever your strengths are, those are the levers of change you need to be pulling. Those are the levers so if you have these 5 levers, you say, well, should I change all 5? Like you said, I got to change more than one. I'm going to pick a couple, right? Well, which ones? Well, it's situationally dependent, but it's also, more importantly, strength dependent. What got you here must necessarily get you there. So if you're a goals person, you do a really good job at goals. Or if you are a relationship person, or you tend to be a deep thinker, look at whatever it is, look at what you tend to do best and make the change there, because that's what you're good at. Make the change in the thing you do best.
How can people identify which of the 5 that they're best at?
Okay, so one of the ways is looking at a Kolbe test, for example, that looks at what your strengths are. Right? So,
well, that's not going to tell me if I'm good at goals or not.
Well, it's going to tell you some things, right? So if you look at something like a Kolbe assessment that says, how do you relate to facts and information? How do you relate to systems and process? How do you relate to uncertainty and change? How do you relate to the physical world around you? And you can gather some things from that, right? So you can gather that, hey, I tend to be fairly systematic at creating systems and process. So maybe you want to create a system and process. If you are a type of person that cuts through systems and processes and looks at streamlining, then maybe you want to streamline. If you're a type of person dealing with facts and figures that tends to think high level and conceptual, maybe that's where you want to build out the strategy. Or do you tend to do you tend to work with, like uncertainty and embrace it? Well, maybe you want to bring on a new product line or something like that. And rather than, you lean into that is the point. Lean into those strengths and lean into what levers of change you want to make based on the strength.
Well, if you go by that example, what if your Kolbe is saying, hey, you're really good at protecting the status quo. You're really good at avoiding taking unnecessary risks. You're a low, quick start individual. Mm-hmm. How is that helpful for me in making a change?
Okay, so it's really helpful in that you may not be in the best person to look at creating the marketing strategy, leading, for example, right? There's some value in looking at protecting status quo, and there's some good attributes in being a counteracting quick start, for example, somebody who avoids mistakes, avoids uncertainty. So what you would say is, all right, there's my strength. What's on the opposite end of that? Maybe I need to build a relationship with somebody who can be a visionary, somebody who can think innovatively, somebody who can think creatively in that aspect. And so I'm going to look at what my strengths are, which is protecting status quo, not making mistakes, being safe, being compliant, those types of things. There's your strength. So are you going to be the guy then that's going to try and start a new product line, take on debt with a company, come up with a new marketing campaign? No, probably not. So you need to look at the relationship lever and say, what do I need to do to bring in a new person who can help me do? So if I'm the implementer, I want a visionary, EOS language.
When it comes to changing goals, what are some examples of how people can change goals? Because I think most people they're looking at, okay, well, we were aiming at 10% a year. Let's try to get 20% a year. That's their initial reaction when it comes to changing goals.
Yeah. So that would be an example. You're making linear changes. All right. So that wouldn't necessarily be a plateau jump, although it's just a bigger change, right? So if you said, I want to make a change in my goal that is if it's linear, right? You've always said, I want to increase by 20%, 10%. Now I'm going to go 20%, whatever. Then think about that goal as the plateau jump. In other words, break loose of this sort of linear progression and say, what would I need to do that scares me, right? That gives me maybe a 50-50 chance of reaching this goal over the next few years, right? So I'll give you an example. There's a process I would go through with coaching. I call it a 2 times vision, right? Double vision exercise, right? So I'll give you this one tool, right? Called double vision exercise when you look at goal setting. And I would go to everybody on my staff, everybody from the receptionist, analyst, the manager, the department leader, on up. And we get in a big room. And I say, all right, I want you to write down, and you write down your salary. You know what you make. I mean, Sanger, you know what you make, right? So let's use you as an example. All right, you know what you make in your business.
Okay.
Right? We are going to get rid of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're firing you. And we're going to hire somebody to do your job. But we're going to pay that person twice as much as we're paying you. Right? And so I would have everybody do this. I said, me included. All right. So if I'm leading this company, I know what I make from running and owning and leading this company. But we're going to fire me and we're going to bring in somebody and we have to pay them twice what I'm making. Okay. What would have to change? All right. So let's take you for example. All right. We're getting rid of you from your company. We're going to bring in somebody. They're going to make twice what you're making right off the bat. What would have to change about that person? How would they be different from you?
In order to justify that amount of money? Or
Yep.
Okay. Well, they'd have to be able to either do a lot more in the business that I'm doing, get better results than what I'm getting.
Okay. So they'd have to bring in more business. All right. So there's one. What else?
They'd have to be able to not also rely on me to do anything. I don't want them to talk to me.
Okay. All right. So they'd have to operate independently. Is that what you're saying?
Sure.
Okay. All right. They wouldn't need a lot of leadership or guidance, I guess. Okay. What else?
They would probably like do household chores for me and do they do other non-business related things. No, they if they're getting good results,
Okay.
they're getting twice as many results as me and they're not bothering me.
All right. So that's where most people go. They look at a results-based answer first, right?
Right.
And they say, well, I'd have to, they'd sell twice as much stuff. That's easy if you're a salesperson. But what if they're the mid-level marketing person or they're the department manager or something like that, and it's not selling something, they're not on a commission, so they don't have that easy answer to say they just sell twice as much stuff. So you start looking at saying, well, what would their background be? And I'd have them start visualizing all this to say, what would their office look if we're paying them twice as much? Oh, okay. I said, what kind of degrees would they have? What kind of technical competencies would they have? What kind of experience would they have? What would their staff look like? What would their assistant look like? Who would they report to? What would their relationships with the vendors look like? And just imagining all of this stuff. And what that gives you is a bag of experiences and competencies and capabilities and goals that you can pull from to go, this is the person I'm trying to become, or this is what this position can grow to. And so now I can say, well, if they were going to pay me twice as much, this person would have this technical certification, for example. Pick one. Okay, well, maybe I need to get that because now my job now has become, how do I transform myself into that person
into that image
that I just described, right? So there's an example of a tactic, and the I don't want to get too much into tactics, but there's an example of one as it relates to goals that you could look at that kind of helps break through to say, how is this different?
What do you think is the easiest of the 5? You said that beliefs is probably the most challenging. Which of the 5 is the simplest?
I don't know that any of them are simple. That's why they kind of rolled up into that high level. By the time you get to these high level, none of them are simplest. But
one of them's got to be the simplest.
Well, some of them. Here's the way I would answer that. There is an answer for everybody, but there's not a universal answer, right? So for you, it might be that systems are the easiest. It's easiest to, if I'm going to make a plateau jump, it's easy to build new systems to do that because you're a systems guy. For somebody else, it might be, relationship. I'll hire new people. I'll get a business coach. I'll change this. I'll change how my clients are reacting. And so relationships might be easy. So there is an easiest one, but there's not a universal easiest one. What's easiest for you? And then lean into that.
Okay. So leveraging your strengths, like you're saying earlier.
Yeah. It's all about leveraging strengths. I'll tell you something about beliefs, and that because that was the hardest one for me. And I'll give it this a stupid example, but
don't share it then.
I'll give you the example anyway. So I used to do these presentations when I was a young financial advisor. And there was one part of the presentation that was talking about goal setting, right? Is, a big part of financial advising is setting goals. And I would quote this study from Harvard that Harvard had done years ago. They had looked at a graduating class of Harvard students, and they went back to them 20 years later, and those students that had goals, most students didn't have any goals. They were just happy to be graduating. Those students that had goals made 10 times more money than those students who didn't.
It's a pretty significant gap.
And it gets better. Those students who had written those goals down made significantly more than those. And so the takeaway is have goals and write them down, right? And they could look at this study of these students from Harvard, and they tracked them. And those that had written goals, it was like 100 times more net worth than those who didn't have any goals. It was like, that's phenomenal. And so one of the things I started looking at in writing Plateau Jumping is I wanted to trace down that study because I thought, well, that really has the power of the mind in it. When we start talking about beliefs, somebody used this study as an example of sort of believing and goal setting at those things, and I could use it in goal setting and beliefs. And so I start looking for this research that I had been seen in lots of books and magazines, and I had actually done in presentations. Here's what's interesting. There was no such study.
What are you saying? They made it up?
I'm saying it's an urban myth.
Really?
There was no study. It's not a real thing. Now, here's what's interesting.
It's something that
is
true. Believable.
It's believable that somebody studied a bunch of Harvard students, but what is not true is that there was a study done at Harvard about that. Now, there was a university out in California, a smaller, I don't remember the name of the university, put it in the book, but who actually realized this same thing that I just told you, and they studied it. Now, turns out the moral of the story is still true.
They found the same results?
They found those results, but there was no baseline study from Harvard that did that. But it is true to say that if you write your goals down, that does have a positive effect on achieving those goals. That's true. So it turns out that what I believed and what everybody else believed about that was not true was that there was some Harvard study tracking students. The underlying truth of the concept was true. Write down your goals, and that has a positive effect. But I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and what if you had found the opposite? What if you had found out, oh wait, there was never a study, and then this new small private school in California recreated it, and they found that it's not true. It makes no difference. They found
the opposite. Yeah, that would have been phenomenal. Yeah, that would have been really interesting.
People are seemingly very resistant to changing their beliefs, even when met with evidence that those beliefs are wrong. I mean, I'm sure that if it had turned out that goal setting didn't do anything to help you achieve anything beyond, the control group said no difference between them. That even when you told people would react and say, well, it's got
to be true. Yeah. In spite of that. Right. Yeah. And that's what's so challenging about writing that part of plateau jumping is on beliefs. So I'll give you another example about the power of belief, and how they can fool you. So, there was a professor this is actually true, professor at Harvard, Ellen Langer, who did a study and she studied these maids that were working at this resort or hotel. And so she was doing this study on health and, blood pressure and things like that on these maids who were working a lot and were not getting a lot. They were not doing any sort of real exercise. They weren't jogging in the morning. They weren't going to the gym. They were just living their life, doing their job. And so she isolated half of them, kept half of them as a control group, and said, okay, just keep doing what you're doing. She took their blood pressure and their weight and their measurements and all this. And for the other half, she explained to them that the physical work they were doing of being a maid, going up and down the steps, moving around, bending over, all those types of things, lifting things, that counted as exercise. He goes, no, this counts. And they're like, oh, okay. And then she came back in about a month and she checked everybody again. And so the control group who didn't get this message, there was no change. The group that she told that what they were already doing and they kept doing counted as exercise. Blood pressure went down by 10%. Measurements got better. They lost weight. Only because the power of their mind and what they believed had that level of real life impact.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm glad that's a lever that I identified because it's certainly important.
Yeah. And the power of visualization too, in I forget what university conducted this study, but they had essentially people, one group of people lift dumbbells, one group of people do nothing at all, and then one group of people imagining themselves lifting a dumbbell. Now, they weren't just thinking about dumbbells in the abstract. They were sitting down and doing a full rep, but only in their mind, not moving their arm at all. And that group, the group that lifted the physical weights, had the solid muscle growth that you would expect. The group that didn't lift any weights and didn't even think about lifting weights had no change. But the group that only imagined themselves lifting the weights had 20 to 25% of the growth, the group that did lift the weights. That's crazy. So you can have 20 to 25%, a quarter of the outcome just by thinking about doing it. And or not thinking about doing it, but visualizing yourself doing it, really truly imagining yourself doing it. So when it comes to belief change, like a belief change in order to be an effective lever, it doesn't have to be change your religion or change your political beliefs or have some complete change of mind. It could be change something about what you're believing, change something about what your mindset is. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll give you another example. So several years ago, so I started doing this work started as a financial advisor, started doing training, and the industry was fairly new. And what we did was we would call people at night during dinner right? There was no internet, to speak of at that point. And you would call people there was no caller ID or cell phones. So you could actually pick up, people would actually answer the phone during dinner because they didn't know if it was their mom or their drug dealer or whatever they'd answer. And so we would set these meetings and we would drive to people's houses, knock on the door and sit down at their kitchen table. And that's where we would do the financial planning. Right. And so it was really old school because that's how they had done it in the 60s and that's how they did it in the 70s. That's, And so our leader in our office went to this meeting with one of his regional guys. And the regional guy said, all right, here's what we're doing. We're going to have everybody start coming to work out of the office. Everybody come to the office. And nobody's going to do that. People aren't going to do that. And he really struggled with it, but he did it and it worked. But it was a real challenge to his beliefs. And it was a challenge to all of ours because all we knew was the way we had done it. Oh, people aren't going to do this, right? Mm-hmm. Or people won't pay this fee, right? And sometimes you're right, but why not try it? Right. And just challenge the way you've always done it, because what you know is if you're at a plateau, is what you're doing now isn't working.
Yeah. In a way that, people have got to recognize whether something's working or not, because if they're at a plateau, it does not necessarily mean that what they're doing isn't working. I mean, it got them to a plateau and you talk about in your book how plateaus they're not bad, they're good. So if you've arrived at a plateau, just because you've found yourself there doesn't mean that necessarily done something wrong. It means you've actually necessarily done something right to be able to be at the campground and have that opportunity to reflect and see where your next move is going to be. So I think a lot of people struggle because they think of things in a right or wrong binary, they struggle to see that there may be areas of improvement because you may be doing something well that is succeeding. I mean, think of that. The financial planning industry wasn't doing anything wrong by going to people's houses.
Right.
They just had not noticed that there was something that could be better. They weren't all failing as an industry.
Right.
They were succeeding as an industry. They just realized, hey, this could be better. And so I think to protect ourselves, we often create stories and beliefs about how right we must be, because that correct opinion, that correct analysis that initially must have occurred in order for us to choose this pathway, we want to hold on to that, because otherwise it means that all the work for the past year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years would have been in vain. I mean, there were people, when jiu-jitsu became to be really, first was brought to the United States in the, mid to late 20th century. Mm-hmm. The Gracie family, who had been training in Brazil and brought jiu-jitsu to Long Beach, California, they knew that what they had was better than other martial arts. They knew it, but they knew that nobody else believed it. So they would do like dojo battles, basically.
Yeah.
They say, hey, we're going to go to the karate school and we're going to challenge the instructor. And this was what the karate schools used to do. But the karate schools stopped doing it once they established their dominance, right?
Right.
So
they were comfortable.
And so they go to the karate schools and they start whooping these guys.
Yeah.
And they're absolutely destroying them. And because as soon as they were able to grab a hold of the karate instructor,
it's over. Yeah,
it's over. The guy's never practiced this. It doesn't matter that he can do spinning back fists and side kicks and all this stuff. And so a good number of these guys, they would beat them, and they would never, ever train jiu-jitsu. They would not change their mind and say, this is a new art that I've missed out on that I ought to pursue.
Wow.
They wouldn't do that. They would come up with a new belief that allowed them to protect their original belief, which was, this is better. Because in order for me to dedicate my life to karate, I've got to, on some level, have a belief that this is better than anything I could be doing. And that's true for anything I'm going to dedicate my life and my career to. I've got to believe on some level it's better to be a wealth advisor than to do anything else I could be doing. Okay. Because if I believe there was something better that I could be doing, I'd go do that. I'm going to be a karate instructor, for me at least, there's nothing that I could do better than this with my life. And so these guys are faced with the reality that this isn't actually the most effective art. It's really actually ineffective largely and leaves me vulnerable. Instead of saying, okay, let me start completely over and learn jujitsu and learn how to be effective as a martial artist, they would say, well, this is, it's low class.
It's not real.
Or it's not real martial art. They're not disciplined. I'll find some new belief that allows me to protect the original belief, which was this is better than anything that I could be doing. Some of them said, all right, like the reality has been so strong that it's convinced me I've got to get on board, but it doesn't always happen.
I heard a great quote one time, and it was, you'll never change the beliefs of someone whose income relies on them not believing.
Yeah, I know a few of those folks.
Yeah. I give you another example. There was a study about these cardiac patients, and what they did, as you might imagine, after somebody has big heart surgery, they give you a list of things to do, right? And a list of things not to do, right? So here's what we want you to eat. Here's what we want you to not eat. We want you to do this exercise. We want you to not do these things. Maybe stop smoking, whatever it is. And so there's a list, as you might imagine. Somebody has heart surgery, and here's the list of things to do. They went back to these people 24 months later and found that what do you think is the percentage of people that were following the prescribed steps, prescribed outline of guidance from the physician?
I don't know.
Shot.
10?
10. It was 1.
Wow.
Yeah, 1%. So here are people that could not change their beliefs that or habits when their life depended on it.
Yeah.
1%. It's amazing.
What's your top decision-making tip for business owners?
Top business tip from. I would say to spend the time on visualization of what the goal is and take it through the steps of saying, what is the big change I want to make? Maybe use that double vision exercise we talked about in looking at how do I decide what steps I need to take for this visualized goal, right? So if I want to look at a goal, I want to take through what is the baseline ante to play at this new level. So what needs to happen as an assumptive existence, what needs to happen there at the new level that is the, of course, part of it, the ante to play. What is my point of distinction that is going to be a little bit different about being at this new level, and what is my point of remarkability? So what is the thing that really gets me excited about this change, right? So spend the time on the visualization because it will become real. It will manifest itself, and you will be able to formulate the goals of saying, what do I need to do? What does it look like to be at this new level? So somebody who's at that new level, how are they different from me? So you'll be able to say, all right, here are the changes. Maybe they work out every day. Maybe they have an assistant. Maybe they do whatever it is that they do. That gives you some ideas on how to create some goals that begin to move you in that direction. So visualization would be the top one.
Perfect. And where can people find a copy of the book?
Copy of the book, Plateau Jumping, is available at Amazon.com. Just type in Plateau Jumping book, and it'll take you right there, and you can buy the Kindle, the paperback, the hardback, whatever you want.
Cool. Thanks.
Right. Hey, thanks for having me.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Shawn's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.